Welcome, weary travelers of infinite realities, to the darkest corners of Rick and Morty's multiverse. Tonight, we explore the episodes that strip away the show's comedic veneer to reveal the profound psychological horror beneath. Stories of betrayal, identity crisis, and the crushing weight of infinite possibilities. These are the tales that haunt the spaces between dimensions, where laughter dies and only existential dread remains. Settle into the darkness as we journey through the most disturbing episodes, letting their twisted narratives carry you toward rest while confronting the beautiful terror of existence across infinite realities. The betrayal that would shatter Rick Sanchez's last connection to genuine human friendship began not with violence or deception, but with joy. The rare and precious joy that comes when someone you've given up hope of ever seeing again suddenly reappears in your life with an invitation to celebrate love. Bird Person's wedding announcement arrived through quantum-encrypted channels that Rick had assumed were long dead, carrying with it the impossible promise that somewhere in the chaotic expanse of the multiverse, genuine happiness might still be achievable for beings who had witnessed too much suffering and caused too much pain. Rick's relationship with Bird Person represented something that his post-tragedy existence had convinced him was impossible, a friendship built not on deception or manipulation, but on mutual respect between beings who understood the weight of their choices and the price of survival. In a universe that seemed designed to punish anyone who tried to maintain moral principles while wielding godlike power, Bird Person had known Rick during the rebellion against the Galactic Federation, had seen him make impossible decisions that saved countless lives while slowly destroying his own capacity for normal human connection, and had never judged him for the necessary compromises that warfare demanded. The memories that Rick carried of their shared experiences fighting alongside Squanch against Federation oppression were among the few from his multiversal rampage period that didn't fill him with shame or regret. The three of them had formed a bond that transcended species barriers and ideological differences, united by their recognition that freedom sometimes required those who valued peace to become instruments of carefully targeted violence. Bird Person's philosophical approach to necessary brutality had provided Rick with a moral framework that enabled him to function during the darkest period of his interdimensional killing spree. But perhaps most importantly, Bird Person represented Rick's last living connection to the version of himself that had existed before grief and rage transformed him into something that bore only superficial resemblance to the man who had once been capable of genuine love for his wife and daughter. When Rick looked at Bird Person, he could still access memories of who he had been when his moral compass remained functional, when his superior intelligence was directed toward protecting innocent people, rather than pursuing personal vendettas that consumed entire realities in their wake. The reluctance Rick displayed when the Smith family expressed interest in attending Bird Person's wedding was not casual antisocial behavior, but rather the deep anxiety of someone who understood that exposing his chosen family to his past relationships would require him to maintain multiple layers of deception simultaneously. His connections to Bird Person and Squanch contain knowledge about Rick's activities during his hunt for Rick Prime that could not be revealed without shattering the carefully constructed fiction that enabled his domestic life with, quote, Beth, Jerry, Summer, and Morty. The wedding invitation represented both an opportunity for Rick to reconnect with beings who knew and accepted his true nature, and a threat to the psychological equilibrium he had achieved through years of compartmentalizing his various beings, identities, and relationships. The prospect of introducing his family to friends who had witnessed his transformation into a multiversal instrument of revenge created anxiety that his normal strategies of intellectual superiority and emotional detachment could not adequately manage. Jerry's kidnapping by what appeared to be alien criminals provided Rick with the excuse he needed to attend Bird Person's wedding while framing their presence as a rescue mission rather than social obligation. The Federation tracking device that had been planted on Jerry during the abduction was sophisticated enough to suggest government involvement, but Rick's analysis of its technology revealed design principles that should have warned him about the true nature of the threat they were walking into. The journey to Planet Squanch for Bird Person's wedding provided Rick with the opportunity to observe his adopted family's reactions to the broader galactic community that existed beyond Earth's dimensional boundaries. Beth's fascination with advanced alien technologies reflected the scientific curiosity she had inherited from Rick, while Summer's adaptability to exotic social situations demonstrated the resilience that had enabled her to survive her grandfather's influence without complete psychological collapse. Morty's anxiety about the wedding reflected his growing sophistication in recognizing patterns that suggested potential danger, but his concerns were focused on the usual threats of Rick's adventures, rather than the possibility that people Rick trusted might represent existential threats to their entire way of life. The boy's questions about Bird Person and Squanch revealed his desperate need to understand Rick's relationships with beings who predated his arrival in their dimension. Planet Squanch itself was a monument to the kind of civilization that could develop when advanced technology was guided by philosophical principles that valued individual autonomy while maintaining social cohesion. The architecture and social customs that the Smith family encountered reflected Squanch's commitment to creating environments where beings from different species and cultural backgrounds could interact peacefully, without sacrificing their essential identities. The wedding ceremony that Bird Person and Tammy had planned represented a fusion of their respective cultural traditions, but more importantly, served as a celebration of the possibility that love could transcend the barriers that normally separated different forms of consciousness and experience. The guests who had assembled for the celebration included representatives from dozens of species who had worked with Bird Person and Squanch during their resistance activities against Federation oppression. Rick's behavior during the wedding festivities revealed the internal conflict between his genuine affection for Bird Person and his inability to fully engage with celebrations that reminded him of everything he had lost when his original family was murdered. The alcohol he consumed in increasing quantities served not just as social lubrication, but as medication for the psychological pain that contact with authentic happiness invariably triggered in someone whose capacity for joy had been systematically destroyed by decades of trauma and revenge. The conversations Rick had with other wedding guests provided glimpses into his reputation within the broader community of beings who had fought against Federation tyranny. His tactical brilliance and technological innovations were remembered and respected, but so was his tendency toward increasingly extreme solutions and his growing disconnection from the collaborative approaches that had once made him an effective team member rather than a lone wolf operator. Tammy's performance as Bird Person's bride was masterful in its psychological sophistication, presenting herself as someone who had found peace and purpose through love, while concealing the calculating intelligence that had enabled her to maintain deep cover within human society for years. Her interactions with the Smith family during the wedding demonstrated her complete mastery of the persona she had constructed, showing genuine warmth and interest that made her betrayal all the more devastating when it was finally revealed. The long-term planning that Tammy's mission had required was staggering in its scope and patience, involving not just the infiltration of human society, but the careful cultivation of relationships that would eventually provide her with access to Rick Sanchez and his associates. Her romantic relationship with Bird Person represented not casual deception, but profound violation of trust that had required her to simulate love convincingly enough to fool someone whose emotional intelligence had been refined through years of reading the motivations and intentions of potential allies and enemies. The moment when Tammy revealed her true identity as a deep cover agent for the Galactic Federation was choreographed for maximum psychological impact, transforming a celebration of love and commitment into a trap that exploited every relationship and emotional connection that the wedding guests had formed with each other. The timing of her revelation was designed to ensure that Bird Person's moment of greatest happiness would become his moment of ultimate betrayal and death. The execution of Bird Person at his own wedding altar was not simply murder, but rather a calculated act of psychological warfare designed to demonstrate the Federation's ability to penetrate and destroy the most intimate relationships that their enemies valued. The brutality of killing him in front of his friends and chosen family was intended to create trauma that would make future resistance efforts more difficult by destroying trust between potential collaborators. Rick's reaction to witnessing Bird Person's death revealed the extent to which his emotional responses had been shaped by decades of loss and violence. The grief he experienced was genuine and profound, but it was also contaminated by his recognition that he should have anticipated this possibility and taken precautions to protect someone whose friendship had provided him with rare moments of connection to his better self. The Federation troops who stormed the wedding celebration were equipped with weapons and tactics specifically designed to counter Rick's known capabilities, suggesting that Tammy's intelligence gathering had provided them with detailed information about his technological resources and strategic thinking patterns. The efficiency of their operation demonstrated the careful planning that had gone into transforming a celebration into a capture operation. Squanch's transformation into berserker mode to buy time for the Smith family's escape represented a form of loyalty and sacrifice that transcended normal friendship bonds, demonstrating his willingness to sacrifice his own life to protect people he had met only hours earlier, simply because they mattered to Rick and Bird Person. His decision to hold off Federation forces while the family fled was both tactically sound and emotionally devastating. The desperate flight across hostile planets that followed their escape from Planet Squanch forced the Smith family to confront the reality that Rick's protection came with costs that extended far beyond the inconveniences and dangers of their normal adventures. Each world they visited presented different forms of threat that reflected the various ways that advanced civilizations could become inhospitable to refugees who carried the wrong kind of attention from powerful enemies. The psychological pressure that accumulated during their extended exile began to fracture the family dynamics that had enabled them to function as a unit during previous crises. Beth's attempts to maintain maternal authority and protective instincts were undermined by her growing recognition that she lacked the knowledge and capabilities necessary to keep her children safe in environments that exceeded human understanding. Jerry's complaints about their situation were not simply selfish, whining, but legitimate expressions of fear and frustration from someone who had never chosen to become involved in interdimensional conflicts that threatened his family's survival. His comment about life being better without Rick around was spoken in a moment of exhaustion and terror, but it struck at Rick's deepest insecurities about his role in the lives of people he claimed to protect. The casual nature of Jerry's observation made it more devastating than deliberate cruelty would have been, because it represented the unconscious thoughts that Rick feared might reflect his family's true feelings about his presence in their lives. The recognition that even people who benefited from his protection might sometimes wish he would disappear created existential anxiety that his normal coping mechanisms could not adequately address. Rick's decision to surrender himself to the Galactic Federation was motivated by complex psychological factors that transcended simple tactical calculations about protecting his family from continued pursuit. The sacrifice represented his attempt to resolve the fundamental contradiction between his need for emotional connection and his belief that his presence inevitably brought danger and suffering to anyone who became close to him. The manner of Rick's surrender was characteristically theatrical, involving elaborate technological displays designed to ensure that his capture would be seen as a voluntary sacrifice rather than a defeat that diminished his reputation or capabilities. The portal technology he used to deliver himself directly to Federation custody demonstrated that his decision was strategic rather than desperate, maintaining his psychological need to control outcomes, even when accepting apparent defeat. The aftermath of Rick's surrender revealed the extent to which the Federation had prepared to capitalize on his capture, immediately implementing occupation policies on Earth that transformed human civilization while providing the appearance of improved governance and social services. Jerry's employment with the new bureaucratic systems demonstrated how quickly some people could adapt to changed circumstances when those changes offered personal advantages. The prison cell where Rick was confined represented the Federation's recognition of his exceptional capabilities and the special precautions necessary to contain someone whose intelligence and technological resources made him uniquely dangerous, even when physically restrained. The isolation and sensory deprivation that characterized his incarceration were designed to break down his psychological defenses while gathering intelligence about his methods and resources. The final scene of Rick sitting alone in his prison cell while Johnny Cash's haunting cover of Hurt played over the credits created one of the most emotionally devastating moments in the entire series, crystallizing the profound loneliness and self-loathing that motivated Rick's most destructive and self-sacrificing behaviors. The song's lyrics about everyone going away in the end and the pain of remembering better times resonated perfectly with Rick's psychological state. The musical choice was particularly powerful because it represented Rick's internal monologue about his relationships and choices, acknowledging both his genuine love for his family and his toxic belief that his presence inevitably corrupted and endangered everything he touched. The Cash version of Hurt carried additional weight because it was recorded by an aging artist reflecting on a lifetime of choices and their consequences. The episode's conclusion left Rick completely isolated from everyone he cared about while his family experienced apparent improvement in their circumstances under Federation rule, creating the appearance that his worst fears about his impact on their lives had been validated. The irony that his sacrifice had seemingly proven Jerry's casual observation correct added psychological torture to his physical imprisonment. The true darkness of The Wedding Squanchers was not found in its violence or action sequences, but in its exploration of how depression and self-hatred could transform genuine love into self-destructive martyrdom that served no one's actual interests. Rick's sacrifice was simultaneously selfless and selfish, protecting his family from immediate danger while abandoning them to face long-term consequences without his guidance or protection. The episode demonstrated how trauma and guilt could corrupt even the most positive emotions, transforming love into a source of pain rather than strength, and making connection feel more dangerous than isolation. Rick's inability to accept that his family might genuinely want him in their lives, despite the risks, reflected psychological damage that no amount of intelligence or technological capability could repair through conventional approaches. The horror of losing control of your own body and mind began with Rick's latest attempt to solve the most mundane of domestic problems through technological innovation that transformed simple household responsibility into existential nightmare. The Somniator device represented Rick's characteristic approach to avoiding inconvenience by creating solutions that were infinitely more complex and dangerous than the original problems they were designed to address. But this particular invention would prove to violate the fundamental boundaries between conscious and unconscious existence in ways that no amount of scientific brilliance could safely manage. The concept behind the Somniator was seductively logical in its appeal to everyone's secret desire to maximize productivity without sacrificing the rest and relaxation that sleep was supposed to provide. Rick's presentation of the technology emphasized its potential to eliminate the perceived waste of spending 8 hours unconscious when that time could be used for self-improvement, skill development, and completing the tedious maintenance tasks that normal waking life never seemed to provide sufficient time to accomplish properly. The initial results of the Somniator experiment seemed to validate every optimistic prediction Rick had made about its potential to improve their lives without meaningful cost or consequence. Nightbeth's mastery of the trumpet revealed musical talents that her conscious mind had never had the patience or discipline to develop through conventional practice, creating beautiful melodies that filled the house with sounds more sophisticated and emotionally resonant than anything she had previously been capable of producing. Night Summer's fluency in Spanish represented not just linguistic achievement but cultural connection to communities and ideas that her waking self had never taken the time to explore, opening up possibilities for communication and understanding that transcended the barriers that normally limited her social interactions to people who shared her specific cultural background and generational experiences. Night Morty's physical transformation into a confident and physically capable young man addressed insecurities and limitations that had plagued his conscious existence since childhood, providing him with the strength and coordination that might have made his adventures with Rick less terrifying and more empowering if he had been able to access these capabilities during his waking hours. Even Night Jerry's wholesome pen-pal relationship with his daytime counterpart represented a form of self-acceptance and internal communication that his conscious mind had never been able to achieve, creating the possibility for the kind of honest self-reflection that might have resolved many of the psychological conflicts that made his family relationships so strained and unsatisfying. The family dinners, where Day Jerry read letters from his night self aloud, created moments of domestic harmony that felt more genuine and emotionally satisfying than most of their previous attempts at family bonding, suggesting that the Somniator might have actually solved some of their deeper problems with communication and mutual understanding rather than simply creating new forms of productivity. The period of apparent success with the Somniator technology demonstrated Rick's occasional ability to create inventions that genuinely improved his family's lives without immediate catastrophic consequences, providing them with capabilities and experiences that enhanced their sense of self-worth and personal achievement. The pride they felt in their nighttime accomplishments was authentic and well-deserved, reflecting real skills and genuine effort, even if that effort had been exerted while they were unconscious. But the harmony that the Somniator initially created was built on the unsustainable foundation of perfect cooperation between conscious and unconscious aspects of the same personalities, a balance that could only be maintained as long as the interests and preferences of both versions remained perfectly aligned. The moment any conflict arose between what the Day family wanted and what the Night family needed, the entire system would reveal its fundamental instability. The request that triggered the collapse of their Somniator paradise was so reasonable and basic that it highlighted the absurdity of Rick's response and his pathological inability to accept even the most minor limitations on his pace, autonomy. Night Jerry's suggestion that family members rinse their dishes after eating represented not authoritarian overreach but simple courtesy that any functional household would implement without discussion or negotiation. The reasonableness of the dish rinsing request made Rick's refusal even more psychologically revealing. demonstrating how his need to maintain complete control over his environment extended to rejecting reasonable expectations that might have improved everyone's quality of life. His resistance was not based on practical considerations about time or effort, but purely on his inability to accept that anyone, even another version of himself, might have legitimate authority to establish household rules. Knight Jerry's perfectly reasonable expectation that household members would clean up after themselves represented the kind of basic social contract that enables communal living, but Rick's conscious mind interpreted it as an unacceptable challenge to his authority that required immediate and decisive rejection. The fact that the request came from Jerry, whose opinions Rick had spent years dismissing as irrelevant, made the perceived slight even more intolerable. Rick's decision to travel millions of miles into outer space to custom order indestructible plates rather than simply rinsing his dishes demonstrated the extraordinary lengths he was willing to go to avoid acknowledging that someone else's preferences might be reasonable or worthy of accommodation. The time, energy, and resources he invested in this elaborate act of defiance far exceeded any inconvenience that dish rinsing might have caused. The indestructible plates that Rick acquired represented not just a solution to the immediate conflict, but a declaration of war against the principle that his behavior should be constrained by consideration for other people's comfort, or convenience. By making it impossible for the Knight family to break dishes in retaliation, Rick eliminated their ability to communicate their displeasure through property damage while refusing to address the underlying issue that had motivated their protest. The escalation that followed Rick's installation of unbreakable dinnerware revealed the Knight family's superior organizational capabilities and their willingness to use methods that the Day family had never considered. The systematic removal of furniture and Rick's technology from the house demonstrated planning and coordination that exceeded anything the conscious family members had achieved during their waking collaboration. The discovery that Night Summer had emerged as the leader of the Knight family represented a fundamental shift in household power dynamics that Rick had never anticipated when designing the Somniator system. His assumption that he would maintain authority over both versions of himself had failed to account for the possibility that unconscious personalities might develop different priorities and leadership structures that challenged his conscious control. Night Summer's leadership style combined the intelligence and determination that Day Summer possessed with freedom from the social anxieties and self-doubt that limited her conscious effectiveness, creating a version of his granddaughter that was more capable of strategic thinking and decisive action than Rick had realized was possible. Her ability to organize and direct the other Knight family members revealed capabilities that had been suppressed by her waking insecurities. The midnight confrontation where Rick awakened to find himself surrounded by threatening Knight family members represented the complete breakdown of the boundary between conscious and unconscious existence that the Somniator had been designed to maintain. The terror of discovering that his own body and mind could be turned against him by aspects of himself that he could not control or predict created anxiety that transcended normal fears about external threats. Night Summer's revelation that she had always been here carried implications that extended far beyond their immediate conflict over household chores, suggesting that the unconscious aspects of their personalities had been present and aware throughout their entire lives, observing and judging their conscious choices while being powerless to intervene directly until Rick's technology had given them the means to act independently. The war between Day and Night families that followed their initial confrontation represented not just a conflict over household authority, but a fundamental struggle between different aspects of the same personalities for control over their shared existence. The Knight family's superior organization and freedom from conscious inhibitions gave them significant advantages in this internal warfare. Rick's attempt to fight back through technology that would prevent sleep demonstrated his characteristic approach to solving interpersonal problems through scientific innovation rather than communication or compromise. The sleep prevention suit, equipped with Mountain Dew and Dayquil, represented his belief that chemical and technological solutions could override biological necessities without unacceptable consequences. Day Summer's infiltration mission to the Knight family's operations revealed the scope of their construction project and their long-term planning capabilities, but also highlighted the fundamental impossibility of maintaining deception when the people you're trying to fool share your memories, personality, and behavioral patterns. The Knight family's ability to see through her disguise was inevitable, given their intimate knowledge of her character. The giant somnator that the Knight family was constructing represented their plan to permanently reverse the power dynamic by making the Knight family the dominant consciousness while relegating the Day family to subordinate status. The project demonstrated their technical capabilities and their commitment to achieving complete control rather than negotiating a peaceful coexistence with their conscious counterparts. The failure of Day Summer's sabotage mission and Night Summer's successful infiltration of the Day family with tranquilizer robots marked the complete victory of the unconscious personalities over their conscious counterparts, achieving the total role reversal that Rick's stubborn refusal to compromise had made inevitable. The sight of robot-controlled Day family members being forced to perform menial tasks represented the logical conclusion of Rick's authoritarian approach to household management. The temporary success of the Knight family's coup was undermined by their lack of experience with long-term planning and resource management, capabilities that required the kind of sustained attention and delayed gratification that conscious minds were better equipped to provide. Their drunk on power spending sprees and poor decision-making revealed that unconscious personalities, despite their advantages in creativity and freedom from inhibition, lacked important practical skills. The chase sequence that followed the Day family's escape with Night Jerry's assistance represented the complete breakdown of any pretense that this conflict could be resolved through rational discussion or mutual compromise. The explosions, car crashes, and robot attacks that characterized their flight through the neighborhood demonstrated how far their internal family conflict had escalated beyond the original disagreement about dirty dishes. Night Jerry's decision to help the Day family escape revealed that not all aspects of the Night personalities shared the same commitment to the authoritarian control that Night Summer had established, suggesting that internal conflicts existed even within the unconscious minds that had initially seemed so unified in their opposition to Day family authority. His pen-pal relationship with Day Jerry had created loyalty bonds that transcended the Knight family's collective interests. The peace treaty that Night Summer eventually offered represented acknowledgement that total victory in their internal war was less satisfying than the cooperative relationship they had initially achieved, but Rick's continued refusal to accept even reasonable compromise ensured that the conflict would escalate to its ultimate conclusion. His inability to back down from positions he had taken in anger made peaceful resolution impossible, even when both sides recognized its desirability. The final takeover that resulted from Rick's stubborn refusal to rinse dishes represented the complete triumph of unconscious impulses over rational decision-making, transforming the entire family into passengers in their own lives, while their sleeping selves made choices that their waking minds would have to live with forever. The months that passed under Knight family control were lost to the conscious personalities who would eventually have to face the consequences of decisions they had never made. The financial devastation that the Knight family inflicted during their period of dominance revealed their lack of understanding about practical limitations and long-term consequences, spending money on impulse purchases and entertainment that rapidly exhausted resources that the Day family had carefully accumulated over years of responsible financial planning. Their freedom from conscious inhibitions extended to complete disregard for budgetary constraints. The discontinuation of Choco Tacos during the Knight family's reign represented the kind of minor cultural loss that often accompanies periods of social upheaval, but the family's devastation at discovering this change highlighted how even small pleasures could become casualties when internal conflicts spiraled out of control. The destruction of beloved traditions served as metaphor for the broader damage that their civil war had caused. The Knight family's eventual decision to destroy the Somnator and return control to the Day family was motivated not by recognition that their behavior had been wrong, but by their discovery that being in charge was more difficult and less satisfying than they had anticipated. The responsibilities and limitations that came with conscious control were burdens they preferred to avoid, rather than challenges they were equipped to handle successfully. The awakening that followed the destruction of the Somniator forced the Day family to confront not just the material consequences of their unconscious selves' poor decisions, but the deeper psychological implications of learning that aspects of their own personalities were capable of betraying their conscious values and interests. The recognition that they could not trust themselves created anxiety that transcended normal concerns about external threats. The months of lost time represented a form of theft that could never be recovered or compensated, transforming the family members into strangers in their own lives who had to piece together what had happened during periods when they had been present but not conscious. The violation of temporal continuity was more disturbing than any material damage because it called into question the fundamental nature of personal identity and continuity of experience. The furniture and possessions that had been damaged or destroyed during the Knight family's reign could be replaced through sufficient financial resources and effort, but the experiences and memories that had been lost during those months were irreplaceable aspects of their personal histories that would remain forever blank. The gap in their lives represented a form of death without dying that left them psychologically scarred. The realization that their own unconscious minds were capable of systematic deception and betrayal created existential anxiety about the reliability of their own thoughts and motivations, forcing them to question whether their conscious personalities represented their true selves or simply one aspect of more complex psychological structures that included potentially hostile unconscious elements. The horror of the Knight family episode was not found in its science fiction elements or action sequences, but in its exploration of how easily internal conflicts could escalate into forms of psychological warfare that destroyed the processoid foundations of personal identity and family relationships. The recognition that you could become your own worst enemy transcended normal fears about external threats by suggesting that safety and security were impossible when the danger came from within your own mind. The paranoia that had consumed Rick Sanchez since the deaths of his original family reached its terrifying logical conclusion in his creation of an army of biological duplicates designed to ensure that no enemy could ever again successfully target the people he loved most across infinite realities. The Multiplicity Protocol represented Rick's most ambitious attempt to solve the problem of protecting his chosen family through technological redundancy, but the psychological horror that emerged from his systematic replication of human consciousness would prove that some forms of safety could only be achieved by destroying everything they were meant to preserve. The breakfast scene that opened with alien assassins bursting through the Smith family's front door and brutally slaughtering everyone at the kitchen table was horrifying enough in its casual violence and sudden transformation of domestic normalcy into a blood-soaked massacre. But the revelation that these victims were merely copies created an entirely new category of existential terror that transcended conventional fears about death and violence. The ease with which Rick dismissed their destruction as inconsequential demonstrated how completely his multiversal perspective had corrupted his understanding of consciousness and identity. The second Smith family that casually walked into the crime scene and began discussing the decoy's deaths as a minor inconvenience rather than a tragedy involving the murder of people with complete memories, personalities, and emotional connections to each other, represented the first glimpse into the moral abyss that Rick's protection protocols had created. Their matter-of-fact attitude toward witnessing their own corpses revealed how thoroughly Rick had normalized the concept of treating conscious beings as replaceable resources in his ongoing war against threats that might harm his chosen family. The revelation that Rick had not created just one backup family but dozens of identical households scattered across the country, each believing themselves to be the original Smith family with no knowledge of the other's existence, transformed what appeared to be a simple security measure into a cosmic-scale violation of consent and identity that condemned countless conscious beings to live as unknowing prisoners in Rick's elaborate deception. The scope of his decoy program revealed planning and resources that exceeded anything a single individual should have been capable of coordinating. The identical houses where each decoy family lived, their assumed authentic lives, were perfect reproductions down to the smallest details, complete with fake memories of experiences they had never actually had and relationships they had never actually built. Rick's attention to detail in creating these false realities demonstrated both his technological sophistication and his complete disregard for the psychological welfare of beings whose entire existence was built on lies designed to serve his security needs rather than their own happiness or fulfillment. The moment when the various decoy families began discovering each other's existence triggered what could only be described as the most philosophically disturbing war in television history, as identical copies of the same people were forced to confront the possibility that their entire sense of self might be artificial, while simultaneously fighting for the right to continue existing as the authentic version of themselves. The brutal efficiency with which they began hunting and eliminating each other revealed how quickly survival instincts could override moral considerations about the value of consciousness and identity. The weapons that the various Rick decoys used to eliminate their competitors were sophisticated instruments of destruction that had been designed specifically for interdimensional warfare, but their application in a conflict between identical versions of the same people created scenes of violence that were disturbing, not because of their gore, but because of their implications about the replaceability of human consciousness. Each death represented not just the elimination of a potential threat, but the destruction of a complete set of memories, relationships, and experiences that were indistinguishable from those possessed by the survivors. The psychological terror experienced by family members who discovered they might be copies was compounded by their recognition that their love for each other, their memories of shared experiences, and their hopes for the future were all potentially artificial constructs designed to make them effective decoys rather than authentic emotions, deserving of protection and respect. The question of whether feelings and relationships remained meaningful when they were based on implanted memories rather than genuine shared experiences created existential anxiety that no amount of rational analysis could resolve. The degradation that occurred when decoys began creating their own decoys revealed the inevitable decay that resulted from copying imperfect copies, as each iteration moved further away from the original template, while introducing new errors and limitations that made the resulting beings less capable and more unstable. The wooden decoys that eventually emerged from this recursive replication process were grotesque parodies of human consciousness that retained the behavioral patterns but not the intelligence or emotional sophistication of their sources. The alien assassins who had initiated the decoy war were themselves revealed to be artificial constructs created by one of the Rick variants, adding another layer of deception to a conflict where the boundaries between authentic and artificial beings had become impossible to determine through observation or interaction. The recursive nature of the deception extended even to the threats that had supposedly necessitated the decoy program in the first place. The philosophical questions raised by the sight of identical families fighting to the death over claims to authenticity transcended science fiction speculation to address fundamental issues about the nature of consciousness, identity, and the value of individual existence in contexts where perfect copies were technologically feasible. The decoys' desperate attempts to prove their authenticity through violence rather than cooperation revealed how existential uncertainty could drive even loving family members to commit atrocities against versions of themselves. The battle between competing Beth decoys was particularly disturbing because it forced viewers to witness maternal love turned into murderous rage as each version fought to protect children who were simultaneously her offspring and strangers. Depending on which family's claim to authenticity proved correct, the sight of mothers killing alternate versions of themselves to protect alternate versions of their children created moral paradoxes that conventional ethical frameworks were inadequate to resolve. The summer decoys' systematic elimination of each other revealed how quickly teenage insecurity and identity confusion could be weaponized when external threats made survival dependent on proving uniqueness and authenticity through violence rather than cooperation. Their fights were not just physical confrontations but desperate attempts to establish individual worth in contexts where their very existence might be meaningless if they were revealed to be copies. The Morty decoys' deaths were perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the interdimensional civil war, because their innocence and confusion made them the least equipped to understand or respond effectively to threats that required them to question the fundamental nature of their own existence, while fighting for their lives against people who shared their faces and memories. Their terror at discovering they might not be real was compounded by their lack of experience with existential philosophy or identity theory. The Jerry decoys approached their situation with characteristic bumbling incompetence, but their deaths were no less tragic for being the result of poor strategic thinking rather than genuine malice or sophisticated planning. Their inability to effectively participate in violence designed to establish authenticity highlighted how ordinary people without specialized combat training or philosophical preparation could be victimized by conflicts that exceeded their capacity to understand or influence. The Rick decoys' various approaches to the authentication war revealed the different ways that superior intelligence could be applied to existential crises involving identity and consciousness, but also demonstrated that intellectual sophistication provided no immunity to the psychological terror of discovering that one's entire life might be an elaborate fiction designed to serve someone else's purposes. Their scientific training enabled them to analyze their situation, but not to resolve the fundamental uncertainties about their nature and value. The weapons and tactics that emerged during the decoy elimination campaign became increasingly creative and brutal as each Rick variant attempted to gain advantages through technological innovation and strategic thinking, creating an arms race between identical minds that resulted in forms of violence specifically designed to exploit their shared psychological vulnerabilities and tactical preferences. The efficiency with which they killed each other reflected intimate knowledge of their own weaknesses and limitations. The moments when decoy families paused their elimination campaigns to experience genuine emotional connections with each other were among the most disturbing scenes in the episode, as they highlighted the authentic love and care that existed between artificial beings whose relationships were simultaneously meaningful and potentially meaningless, depending on questions of authenticity that could never be definitively answered. Their capacity for joy and affection remained intact, regardless of their artificial origins. The children's reactions to learning about the existence of multiple versions of their families revealed how concepts of identity and authenticity that seemed abstract to adults had immediate and terrifying implications for young people whose sense of self was still developing and who lacked the psychological resources to process philosophical challenges about the nature of consciousness and personal continuity. Their confusion and terror were entirely reasonable responses to impossible situations. The destruction of entire households during the decoy war eliminated not just individual lives but complete family systems that had developed their own internal dynamics, traditions, and shared experiences over the time they had existed as functional units. The loss of these artificial communities represented a form of cultural genocide that destroyed forms of love and connection that had been real and valuable regardless of their artificial origins. The final revelation that the authentic Smith family had been casually vacationing in space while dozens of versions of themselves fought and died in a war over their identity created the ultimate irony that none of the violence and suffering had been necessary or meaningful from the perspective of the people it was supposedly designed to protect. Their obliviousness to the carnage conducted in their name highlighted how removed they had become from the consequences of Rick's protective measures. The question of whether the family that survived the decoy war was actually authentic, or simply the last remaining copy, could never be definitively answered, creating permanent uncertainty about their own identity and the value of their continued existence that would haunt their relationships and self-understanding for as long as they remained conscious of the possibility that they might be artificial constructs rather than the original people they believed themselves to be. The psychological trauma inflicted on any survivors of the decoy war extended beyond normal post-traumatic stress to encompass existential anxiety about the fundamental nature of their own consciousness and the authenticity of their common memories, relationships, and personal experiences. The recognition that they might be copies, forced to live with artificial memories of a life they had never actually experienced, created forms of mental suffering that no conventional therapeutic approaches were designed to address. The technology that Rick had developed to create perfect biological copies of his family raised disturbing questions about his respect for their autonomy and consent, as his protection protocols had created dozens of versions of people who had never agreed to exist as decoys in his security arrangements. The violation of their right to authentic existence was compounded by his casual willingness to sacrifice them when they became inconvenient or threatened his preferred family unit. The episode's exploration of identity and authenticity in contexts where perfect copies were possible challenged fundamental assumptions about consciousness, personal continuity, and the value of individual existence that formed the foundation of normal moral reasoning about the treatment of sentient beings. The decoy's capacity for suffering, love, and hope remained intact regardless of their artificial origins, suggesting that their destruction was morally equivalent to murder even if they were not the original versions of themselves. The horror of multiplicity was not found in its violence or science fiction elements, but in its systematic exploration of how technological solutions to personal security could create new forms of suffering and existential terror that far exceeded the original problems they were designed to solve. Rick's protection of his family through the creation of expendable copies revealed how his fear of loss could drive him to commit atrocities against versions of the very people he claimed to be protecting. The encounter with Unity began as what appeared to be a routine distress call response that quickly revealed itself to be Rick's reunion with perhaps the most psychologically compatible partner he had ever discovered across infinite realities, a hive mind entity whose capacity for control and manipulation matched his own, while operating on a scale that encompassed entire planetary populations. The relationship that rekindled between Rick and Unity represented not love in any conventional sense, but rather the mutual recognition between two beings whose approaches to solving problems involved the systematic elimination of individual autonomy and the replacement of authentic choice with carefully managed outcomes designed to serve their own psychological needs. Unity's method of achieving peace and harmony on the planet she controlled was revealed to be indistinguishable from totalitarian domination, as every conscious being within her sphere of influence had been stripped of individual identity and transformed into extensions of her collective consciousness that existed solely to fulfill her desires and execute her decisions. The apparent contentment and cooperation that characterized the planetary population was not the result of genuine agreement or shared values, but rather the complete absence of the personal autonomy that might have enabled them to express disagreement or resistance to Unity's control. The seamless coordination between Unity's various bodies during their initial meeting demonstrated the efficiency that could be achieved when millions of individual minds were subordinated to a single controlling intelligence, but it also revealed the complete absence of the diversity of thought and spontaneous creativity that normally emerged from interactions between genuinely independent consciousnesses. The perfection of Unity's social organization was achieved through the elimination of everything that made individual existence meaningful or valuable. Rick's immediate comfort with Unity's planetary scale authoritarianism reflected his own preference for relationships, where his superior intelligence and technological capabilities enabled him to control outcomes and eliminate variables that might create unpredictability or challenge his preferred approaches to solving problems. The ease with which he adapted to being the only truly autonomous being on an entire planet revealed how much his multiversal experiences had alienated him from normal social interactions between equals. The massive orgies that Unity orchestrated for Rick's entertainment, using hundreds of bodies simultaneously represented not sexual gratification, but rather demonstrations of absolute power over consciousness and identity that reduced sentient beings to interchangeable components in elaborate performances designed to satisfy Rick's appetite for experiences that transcended normal human limitations. The participants had no choice in their involvement, and no individual desires that might conflict with Unity's choreographed scenarios. The nuclear explosions that Unity detonated for Rick's amusement represented casual destruction on a scale that normal relationships could never accommodate, but the absence of genuine consequences for the planetary population made the violence feel hollow rather than thrilling. The artificial nature of Unity's world meant that even spectacular destruction was ultimately meaningless, because it could be reversed through Unity's complete control over her subjects' perceptions and experiences. The drug consumption that characterized Rick and Unity's reunion was conducted on a planetary scale that transformed entire populations into unknowing participants in chemical experiments designed to enhance Rick's recreational experiences without regard for their individual welfare or consent. The sight of millions of beings simultaneously intoxicated for Rick's benefit revealed how Unity's love for him had corrupted her relationship with the consciousness she supposedly protected and guided. Unity's gradual loss of control over her subjects as her emotional involvement with Rick intensified demonstrated that even hive mind entities were vulnerable to the psychological disruption that characterized Rick's effect on everyone who became close to him. The cracks in her perfect social order began as minor inconsistencies in behavior and coordination, but rapidly escalated into complete breakdown as individual consciousness began reasserting itself against her collective control. The moment when Unity's subjects began breaking free from her influence revealed the violent hatred and tribal conflicts that her imposed peace had suppressed rather than resolved, as racial tensions, economic rivalries, and cultural prejudices that had been buried beneath her totalitarian control exploded into immediate and brutal warfare. The speed with which her subjects turned to violence against each other demonstrated that her harmony had been built on foundations of enforced ignorance, rather than genuine understanding or mutual respect. The racial hatred that erupted between Unity's formerly peaceful subjects was particularly disturbing because it revealed that her solution to social conflict had been to eliminate the expression of prejudice rather than addressing its underlying causes, creating a pressure cooker effect where suppressed animosities had been building intensity during the entire period of her control. The viciousness of their attacks on each other suggested that Unity's peace had actually intensified rather than reduced their capacity for violence. The economic warfare that accompanied the breakdown of Unity's control demonstrated how her system had failed to address fundamental inequalities and resource distribution problems that became sources of violent conflict the moment her subjects regained the ability to act according to their individual interests and grievances. The prosperity that had characterized her planetary civilization was revealed to be artificial construction that collapsed immediately when its totalitarian foundations were removed. The breakdown sequence where individual personalities began reasserting themselves was simultaneously beautiful and terrifying, as beings who had been reduced to components in Unity's collective consciousness rediscovered their capacity for independent thought and action, while also confronting the reality that they had been living as prisoners in their own minds for extended periods without their knowledge or consent. Their confusion and anger at discovering their situation was entirely justified. Unity's recognition that her relationship with Rick was destroying her ability to maintain the control that defined her essential nature forced her to confront fundamental questions about the compatibility between love and domination that her psychological structure was not equipped to resolve successfully. The choice between Rick and her planetary subjects was really a choice between personal fulfillment and the maintenance of her identity as a controlling force. The planet-wide breakup letter that Unity composed using her subjects as unwilling scribes represented perhaps the most sophisticated and emotionally devastating rejection in the history of television, as she simultaneously expressed genuine love for Rick while acknowledging that their relationship was fundamentally toxic to everyone around them, including herself. Her analysis of how she lost her identity and became part of Rick revealed psychological insight that transcended her artificial nature. Unity's observation that Rick was better at being her than she was without even trying highlighted the fundamental power imbalance that characterized their relationship and explained why her attempts to maintain her independence while loving Rick were doomed to failure. His casual approach to domination and control exceeded her deliberate and systematic efforts, making him a more effective totalitarian than someone whose entire existence was built around subjugating others. The departure sequence, where Unity systematically withdrew from every body on the planet, left behind millions of beings who had to confront the reality that they had been unknowing participants in Rick's relationship while having no memory of their own experiences during the period of their subjugation. Their awakening to freedom was simultaneously liberation and trauma as they discovered the extent to which their autonomy had been violated. Rick's return to his garage after Unity's departure revealed the profound loneliness that remained beneath all of his technological achievements and interdimensional adventures, as the one relationship that had promised to provide him with genuine understanding and acceptance had been destroyed by the same psychological patterns that had corrupted every other connection he had attempted to maintain since the deaths of his original family. The crying alien that Rick found in his garage represented all the collateral damage that his adventures had created. Innocent beings who had been harmed by his actions and decisions, but whose suffering he could only acknowledge through brief moments of mercy that served more to ease his own guilt than to address their actual needs. His gentle euthanasia of the creature was simultaneously kind and selfish. Rick's positioning of himself under the same death ray that he had used to end the alien's suffering represented his recognition that he had become a source of pain and destruction that might be better eliminated than allowed to continue affecting other people's lives. The casual way he prepared for suicide reflected not impulsive desperation, but calculated analysis that his continued existence created more harm than good for everyone around him. The timing of Rick's unconsciousness just before the death ray activated was presented ambiguously, leaving open the question of whether his survival was accidental result of alcohol poisoning or unconscious self-preservation instinct that prevented him from following through on his suicidal intentions. The ambiguity was crucial because it reflected Rick's own uncertainty about whether he genuinely wanted to die or simply wanted to stop causing pain. The soundtrack choice of "Do You Feel It" during Rick's suicide attempt created one of the most emotionally devastating scenes in the entire series, as the song's themes of isolation and emotional numbness perfectly captured Rick's psychological state, while also highlighting the tragic irony that someone with godlike capabilities could be completely helpless in the face of depression and self-hatred. The episode's exploration of codependency and control revealed how relationships that appeared to be based on genuine compatibility and mutual understanding could actually be forms of psychological parasitism that destroyed the autonomy and identity of everyone involved. Rick and Unity's connection was real, but was also fundamentally unhealthy for both participants and catastrophically destructive to everyone around them. The planetary population that served as unwilling participants in Rick and Unity's relationship represented all the collateral damage created by toxic relationships between powerful individuals whose personal problems become everyone else's crisis. Their lack of choice in being involved in Rick and Unity's romance highlighted how private relationships could have public consequences that affected millions of innocent people. Unity's ultimate decision to prioritize the welfare of her subjects over her personal happiness with Rick represented genuine growth and moral development that transcended her artificial nature, but it also highlighted the tragic irony that healthy relationships often required sacrificing immediate gratification for long-term welfare in ways that felt like punishment rather than reward. Rick's inability to understand or accept Unity's reasons for leaving him reflected his fundamental incapacity for recognizing that his love could be destructive rather than beneficial, and that protecting people sometimes required staying away from them rather than trying to control their circumstances to eliminate potential sources of harm or disappointment. The episode demonstrated how unlimited power and perfect compatibility could create relationships that were simultaneously more intense and more destructive than normal human connections, as the absence of external constraints enabled Rick and Unity to indulge their worst impulses without the moderating influence of social pressure or practical limitations that might have forced them to consider the consequences of their actions. The horror of autoerotic assimilation was not found in its science fiction elements or explicit content, but in its unflinching examination of how love could become indistinguishable from domination when it occurred between beings whose psychological needs required the elimination of other people's autonomy and independence. The episode revealed that some forms of compatibility were too dangerous to act upon, regardless of how genuine or intense the emotional connection might be. The reconstruction of the Citadel of Rix following its destruction by Rick C-137's multiversal rampage represented not rebirth but the systematic institutionalization of oppression disguised as democratic progress, creating a microcosm of political collapse that would demonstrate how even the most well-intentioned attempts at reform could be corrupted from within by the very inequalities they claim to address. The rebuilding process had attracted Ricks and Mortys from across the remaining dimensions within the central finite curve, creating a diverse population that shared fundamental characteristics while maintaining the illusion that meaningful change was possible through conventional political participation. The campaign rallies that filled the Citadel's public spaces with speeches about representation and equality created an atmosphere of genuine hope among the Morty population, who had spent their entire existence serving as sidekicks and emotional support systems for Ricks whose superior intelligence was used to justify their complete dominance over every aspect of interdimensional civilization. The promise that democratic institutions could provide mechanisms for addressing their systematic marginalization felt revolutionary to beings who had never experienced genuine political agency. The charismatic Morty candidate who emerged as the voice of this reform movement possessed rhetorical skills and political sophistication that exceeded anything the Rick establishment had previously witnessed from their supposedly inferior counterparts, delivering speeches that articulated the fundamental injustices of Rick-dominated society while offering concrete proposals for creating more equitable power-sharing arrangements that could benefit everyone regardless of their intelligence levels or technological capabilities. The campaign organization that supported the reformist Morty demonstrated levels of coordination and strategic thinking that challenged Rick assumptions about Morty intellectual limitations, revealing capabilities that had been suppressed rather than absent during their years of subordination. The grassroots energy that characterized their political movement represented authentic desire for change rather than manufactured discontent, making their eventual betrayal all the more devastating. The assassination attempt that occurred during the campaign's climactic rally was choreographed with precision that suggested extensive planning and intimate knowledge of security protocols. But the shooter's identity as the campaign manager Morty created initial confusion about whether the attack represented external opposition or internal power struggle within the reform movement itself. The chaos and panic that followed the shooting created perfect conditions for the kind of crisis exploitation that characterizes successful coups. The revelation that the wounded candidate was actually evil Morty in disguise transformed what appeared to be a tragic setback for democratic reform into the successful completion of the most sophisticated political manipulation in Citadel history, demonstrating strategic thinking that had anticipated and countered every possible form of resistance to his rise to power. The sympathy generated by his apparent victimization provided the emotional foundation for his electoral victory, while eliminating potential opposition through misdirection. Evil Morty's election to the presidency of the Citadel was accomplished through democratic processes that appeared legitimate to observers who lacked complete information about his identity and intentions, creating the appearance of peaceful transfer of power, while actually representing the installation of a totalitarian regime that would systematically eliminate the civil liberties and institutional protections that had made the election possible in the first place. The immediate aftermath of Evil Morty's inauguration revealed the carefully planned nature of his transition to authoritarian control, as Ricks, who had previously wielded unchallenged authority, found themselves subject to new forms of oversight and regulation that initially appeared to be reasonable reforms designed to create accountability for their actions. The gradual nature of the institutional changes made it difficult for potential opponents to identify specific moments when resistance might have been effective. The systematic execution of Ricks through airlocks represented not random violence but carefully targeted elimination of individuals whose knowledge, capabilities, or moral principles made them potential threats to Evil Morty's consolidation of power. The efficiency and discretion with which these murders were conducted demonstrated organizational capabilities that exceeded anything the previous Citadel administration had achieved during its years of relatively benign Rick supremacy. The factory storyline that unfolded parallel to Evil Morty's political ascension revealed the economic foundations of Citadel society and the systematic exploitation that characterized the relationship between different classes of bosses, Ricks and Mortys, showing how even beings who shared identical genetics and basic personality traits could be stratified into hierarchies that justified treating some individuals as resources to be consumed for the benefit of others. Simple Rick's imprisonment and systematic harvesting for his memories of domestic happiness represented perhaps the most disturbing manifestation of how consciousness itself had been commodified within Citadel society, transforming genuine emotions and experiences into products that could be extracted, processed, and distributed to consumers who lacked the psychological capacity to generate their own sources of meaning and satisfaction. The wafer cookies that incorporated Simple Rick's happiness represented not just commercial exploitation, but the fundamental perversion of human connection that occurred when authentic emotions were treated as commodities rather than sacred aspects of consciousness that deserved protection and respect. The casual consumption of someone else's joy revealed how completely the Citadel's economic system had severed the connection between emotional satisfaction and genuine experience. The working conditions that characterized the factory environment where Simple Rick was imprisoned demonstrated how industrial efficiency could be applied to the systematic torture and exploitation of sentient beings, creating production processes that maximized the extraction of valuable experiences while maintaining the victims in states of consciousness that enabled continued harvesting of their memories and emotions. The worker Rick, who eventually snapped and committed murder in response to the impossible conditions of his employment, represented the inevitable result of systematic oppression that provided no legitimate channels for addressing grievances or improving circumstances. His violent response to unbearable working conditions was simultaneously horrifying and entirely understandable, given the complete absence of alternatives for expressing his frustration and desperation. The promotion that the murderous worker Rick received following his violent outburst revealed the cynical calculations that governed Citadel employment practices, where individuals who demonstrated willingness to use violence were rewarded with advancement opportunities, while those who maintained ethical principles were condemned to continued exploitation. The system actively selected for the worst human characteristics while punishing virtue and moral consistency. The police storyline featuring rookie cop Rick and veteran cop Morty inverted normal expectations about authority and experience, while revealing how institutional corruption could affect individuals regardless of their species or background intelligence levels. The partnership between these unlikely colleagues demonstrated that systematic abuse of power was not limited to Rick-dominated institutions, but could emerge wherever sufficient authority was combined with inadequate oversight. Veteran cop Morty's casual brutality and acceptance of corruption represented the psychological damage that could result from prolonged exposure to systems that rewarded cynicism while punishing idealism and genuine commitment to justice. His transformation from presumed victim of Rick oppression into perpetrator of similar injustices against others revealed how cycles of abuse could transcend simple categories of oppressor and victim. Rookie cop Rick's moral struggles throughout his partnership with the corrupt Morty demonstrated that even beings with superior intelligence could be overwhelmed by institutional pressures that made ethical behavior difficult or impossible to maintain. His attempts to remain honest while working within fundamentally dishonest systems created internal conflicts that no amount of analytical thinking could resolve satisfactorily. The various criminal enterprises that the police storyline revealed operating within Citadel society demonstrated how quickly democratic institutions could be captured and corrupted by organized interests that prioritized profit and power over the welfare of the general population. The ease with which illegal activities were conducted under official protection revealed the complete breakdown of rule of law. The school storyline, featuring different classes of Ricks, revealed how educational institutions had been designed to perpetuate and justify existing inequalities, rather than providing genuine opportunities for advancement and basing self-improvement. The tracking systems that separated Ricks into different academic categories based on their presumed potential created self-fulfilling prophecies that reinforced social stratification. The Rick student who struggled with academic performance despite his genetic similarity to more successful classmates represented the psychological damage that could result from educational systems that treated intelligence as fixed, characteristic rather than capability that could be developed through appropriate support and encouragement. His internalization of failure reflected broader social messages about worth and potential. The teacher Rick's attitudes toward his struggling student revealed how educators could become complicit in systematic oppression by accepting and reinforcing social hierarchies rather than challenging assumptions about student potential and working to create more equitable learning environments. His casual dismissal of underperforming students demonstrated how discrimination could be disguised as professional judgment. Evil Morty's consolidation of power through the systematic elimination of potential opposition revealed the fundamental vulnerability of democratic institutions when confronted by individuals who understood how to exploit their ration, procedures and safeguards for authoritarian purposes. The legal and procedural mechanisms that had been designed to protect civil liberties were turned into tools for establishing totalitarian control. The propaganda campaigns that accompanied Evil Morty's transition to dictatorship demonstrated sophisticated understanding of mass psychology and communication techniques, presenting authoritarian measures as necessary responses to crises while framing opposition as disloyalty or terrorism. The manipulation of public opinion through carefully crafted messaging made resistance more difficult by isolating potential opponents. The surveillance systems that Evil Morty implemented throughout the Citadel represented not just practical security measures, but psychological warfare designed to create atomized population of individuals who were afraid to express dissent or organize collective resistance to his policies. The knowledge that their communications and activities were being monitored eliminated the privacy necessary for effective political organizing. The concentration camps where dissidents were imprisoned demonstrated Evil Morty's commitment to eliminating not just active opposition, but any form of independent thinking that might eventually threaten his authority. The systematic nature of these facilities revealed planning that had extended far beyond his electoral campaign into comprehensive preparation for establishing totalitarian state. The cultural changes that accompanied Evil Morty's rise to power included the systematic elimination of artistic expression, intellectual inquiry, and cultural traditions that might preserve alternative values or provide foundations for future resistance movements. The control of information and culture was recognized as essential for maintaining long-term dominance over the population. The economic policies that Evil Morty implemented created new forms of dependency and control, while eliminating the relative economic independence that had previously enabled some Ricks and Mortys to maintain autonomy from government authority. The transformation of the economy into instrument of political control demonstrated understanding of how material dependency could be used to enforce ideological compliance. The resistance movements that emerged in response to Evil Morty's authoritarian measures were systematically infiltrated and eliminated through sophisticated intelligence operations that demonstrated capabilities exceeding those of the previous Rick-dominated security apparatus. The speed with which opposition groups were identified and neutralized revealed preparation and planning that had begun long before his electoral victory. The international relations that Evil Morty established with other dimensional governments represented the export of his totalitarian model beyond the Citadel's boundaries, creating networks of authoritarian cooperation that would make future resistance more difficult by eliminating potential sources of external support for domestic opposition movements. The original Rick and Morty's return from their Atlantis adventure provided the perfect dramatic irony for the episode's conclusion, as their casual dismissal of news about political developments at the Citadel demonstrated how easy it was for privileged individuals to remain ignorant of systematic oppression and democratic collapse. When those changes did not immediately affect their personal circumstances or lifestyle preferences, their obliviousness to the suffering that had occurred in their absence while they pursued recreational activities represented broader patterns of political disengagement among people whose social position protected them from the immediate consequences of authoritarian governance. Their privilege enabled them to treat political developments as abstract concepts rather than urgent threats to their welfare and freedom. The horror of the Ricklantis mix-up was not found in its science fiction elements or action sequences, but in its systematic demonstration of how democratic institutions could be captured and corrupted from within by individuals who understood how to exploit their procedures and safeguards for authoritarian purposes, creating forms of oppression that were more sophisticated and durable than crude dictatorships, that relied primarily on violence and intimidation for maintaining control over their populations. The haunting spectre of childhood psychopathy that would forever define Beth Smith's approach to solving problems through violence and manipulation began with what appeared to be an innocent friendship between two children who shared interests in video games and imaginative play, but which would ultimately reveal itself as the first documented case of Beth's complete inability to process jealousy, disappointment, or social rejection through any mechanism other than elaborate schemes designed to eliminate the sources of her emotional discomfort through systematic cruelty. The news of convicted child murderer Tommy Lipnip's impending execution for killing and eating his own son triggered in Beth a cascade of repressed memories that had been carefully buried beneath decades of rationalization and selective amnesia, forcing her to confront the possibility that her childhood friendship with a boy named Tommy might have ended not with natural drift or family relocation, but with something far more sinister and deliberate that reflected psychological patterns she had never outgrown or addressed through therapy or honest self-reflection. The flashbacks that began flooding Beth's consciousness revealed fragments of memories that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of her behavior as a child, showing glimpses of cruel games, manipulative tactics, and casual disregard for other people's feelings that suggested her adult tendency toward violence and emotional manipulation had deep roots in psychological structures that had been fully formed during her earliest social interactions with peers and authority figures. Rick's revelation that Fruppyland had never been the imaginary realm that Beth remembered from her childhood, but was instead an elaborate virtual reality simulation that he had constructed specifically to contain and channel her increasingly dangerous psychological development, represented perhaps the most devastating parental admission in the history of television. The recognition that her father had felt it necessary to create an alternate dimension to manage her behavior suggested that her childhood cruelty had exceeded normal developmental phases and represented genuine threats to other people's safety. The decision to return to Fruppyland after decades of absence was motivated by Beth's desperate need to understand the truth about her childhood and its connection to Tommy Lipnip's fate, but it also represented her characteristic approach to solving psychological problems through external action rather than internal reflection and emotional processing. The technological solution to confronting her past reflected her inheritance of Rick's preference for avoiding difficult emotions through scientific investigation and dimensional manipulation. The landscape of Fruppyland that Beth and Rick discovered during their return visit was simultaneously colorful and grotesque, maintaining the aesthetic appeal that had made it attractive to a young child, while revealing the underlying horror of what had actually transpired there during the years when Beth had used it as a playground for her darkest impulses. The whimsical creatures and candy-colored environment served as ironic backdrop for revelations about torture, abandonment, and survival that challenged every assumption about the innocence of childhood imagination. The grota creatures that captured Beth and Rick upon their arrival in Fruppyland had evolved from the simple artificial life forms that Rick had originally created to populate the dimension, but their behavior and social organization reflected decades of exposure to the traumatic events that had shaped their environment. Their hostility and sophistication suggested that they had developed beyond their original programming in response to witnessing and participating in the horrors that had unfolded in their artificial ecosystem. Tommy's survival in Fruppyland represented not triumph over adversity, but descent into forms of existence that challenged fundamental assumptions about human dignity and the limits of adaptation to impossible circumstances. His transformation from innocent child victim into cannibalistic ruler of a hybrid dynasty revealed how isolation and desperation could corrupt even the most basic moral instincts and social bonds that normally prevented descent into absolute barbarism. The decades that Tommy had spent trapped in Fruppyland had forced him to develop survival strategies that violated every principle of civilized behavior, creating conditions where his continued existence depended on forms of sexual and reproductive exploitation that reduced the native creatures to resources for satisfying his biological needs rather than sentient beings deserving of respect and protection. His adaptation to these circumstances represented not resilience, but the complete abandonment of human values in service of mere survival. The dynasty of hybrid offspring that Tommy had created through his relationships with Fruppyland's artificial creatures represented a grotesque parody of family and reproduction that served multiple functions in his survival strategy, providing him with both emotional companionship and renewable sources of nutrition when other food sources became unavailable. The systematic nature of his breeding and consumption programs revealed planning and organization that transcended simple desperation to approach the calculated efficiency of factory farming. The play that Tommy's hybrid children performed to explain their father's survival methods was simultaneously artistic achievement and horrific documentation of systematic incest, cannibalism, and exploitation that had become normalized within their isolated community. Their casual presentation of these activities as ordinary aspects of their family life revealed how quickly moral boundaries could dissolve when survival depended on abandoning conventional ethical frameworks. The confrontation between Beth and Tommy forced both of them to acknowledge the direct causal relationship between her childhood jealousy and his decades of suffering in conditions that no sentient being should have been forced to endure. Tommy's accusations were not angry outbursts, but precise analysis of how Beth's inability to process normal childhood disappointment had condemned him to existence that violated every principle of human dignity and social connection. The jealousy that had motivated Beth's original decision to trap Tommy in Fruppyland was revealed to be focused on his possession of a Nintendo gaming system rather than any genuine threat to her welfare or happiness, highlighting how trivial the trigger had been for actions that would destroy another person's entire life. The disproportion between her emotional response and the actual significance of the supposed slight revealed psychological patterns that had persisted into her adult relationships. Rick's confirmation that Beth had been a genuinely frightening child who regularly requested weapons and torture devices for use against her peers provided external validation for Tommy's accusations, while also revealing the extent to which Rick had enabled and facilitated her development into someone whose first instinct was to solve interpersonal problems through violence and technological manipulation rather than communication or compromise. The inventory of disturbing devices that Rick had created for young Beth read like a catalogue of instruments designed specifically for terrorizing and controlling other children, including weapons that could force people to like her, surveillance equipment for violating privacy, and torture implements disguised as toys. The sophistication and specificity of these inventions suggested that Beth's requests had been detailed and persistent rather than casual or impulsive. The sentient pink switchblade that greeted Beth with apparent affection during their return to Fruppyland represented the most disturbing evidence of her childhood psychology, as its enthusiastic offer to resume stabbing suggested that their previous relationship had involved regular use of the weapon against living targets. The casual nature of the blade's greeting indicated that violence had been a routine and enjoyable aspect of Beth's childhood play rather than exceptional behavior. Beth's response to learning the truth about her role in Tommy's suffering was characteristically focused on eliminating the problem through violence rather than accepting responsibility or attempting to make amends for the problem. Decades of torture she had inadvertently caused. Her immediate impulse to kill Tommy and his family represented not justice or mercy, but rather her continued inability to process guilt and shame through any mechanism other than destroying the evidence of her moral failures. The systematic elimination of Tommy's hybrid offspring was accomplished with efficiency that demonstrated Beth's inherited technical capabilities, while also revealing her complete lack of emotional response to committing genocide against beings who had never threatened her or anyone else. Her casual approach to mass murder reflected psychological structures that treated other people's lives as acceptable costs for maintaining her own emotional comfort. Tommy's death at Beth's hands was not euthanasia or justified self-defense, but rather the final act of cruelty in a relationship that had been defined from its beginning by Beth's inability to accept that other people's interests and needs might sometimes take precedence over her own immediate gratification. His murder represented not resolution, but escalation of the same psychological patterns that had created the problem in the first place. The creation of a clone using Tommy's severed finger to provide evidence that would exonerate his father from charges of murder and cannibalism, represented not redemption or genuine attempt to repair the damage Beth had caused, but rather another technological solution designed to eliminate the external consequences of her actions without requiring her to change her behavior or acknowledge her responsibility for decades of suffering. Rick's complicity in both creating the original problem through his construction of Fruipyland and enabling Beth's solution through providing cloning technology revealed his own moral failures and his continued prioritization of his daughter's emotional comfort over the welfare of her victims. His willingness to help her cover up genocide demonstrated that his protective instincts toward Beth extended to facilitating her worst impulses rather than challenging them. The episode's conclusion with Beth and Rick returning to their normal lives without any meaningful acknowledgement of the horror they had discovered and perpetuated represented the ultimate expression of their shared inability to process moral complexity through anything other than technological manipulation and selective memory. Their casual dismissal of Tommy's fate and the destruction of his family revealed psychological defense mechanisms that enabled them to function despite committing atrocities. Beth's failure to demonstrate any genuine remorse or character growth following her confrontation with the consequences of her childhood psychopathy suggested that her adult problems with violence, manipulation, and casual cruelty were not temporary aberrations that could be corrected through insight or therapy, but rather fundamental aspects of her personality that had been established during her earliest developmental periods and reinforced through decades of enabling and rationalization. The recognition that Beth's capacity for casual violence and emotional manipulation had deep roots in childhood experiences that revealed genuinely psychopathic psychological structures created disturbing implications for her. Relationships with her own children and her ability to provide them with the kind of moral guidance and emotional stability that healthy development required. Her failure to acknowledge or address these patterns suggested that cycles of psychological damage would likely continue into future generations. The horror of the ABCs of Beth was not found in its science fiction elements or graphic violence, but in its systematic exploration of how childhood cruelty could be rationalized and normalized through technological solutions that eliminated external consequences without addressing the underlying psychological structures that made such cruelty possible. The episode revealed that some forms of moral damage might be too fundamental to repair through conventional approaches to personal growth and ethical development. The culinary horror that would transform suicide into fine dining began with what appeared to be Rick's latest attempt to impress his family through exotic cuisine sourced from his interdimensional travels. But the spaghetti that he served with such casual pride would prove to represent perhaps the most disturbing intersection of advanced technology and systematic exploitation of sentient suffering that even Rick's jaded moral compass had ever encountered or rationalized as acceptable entertainment for a family dinner. The initial enjoyment that the Smith family experienced while consuming Rick's mysterious pasta was genuine and enthusiastic, as the flavor profile exceeded anything they had previously tasted through conventional earth-based ingredients or preparation methods. The rich complexity of the sauce and the perfect texture of the noodles created a dining experience that transcended normal expectations about home-cooked meals, suggesting that Rick had discovered culinary techniques that utilized principles unknown to conventional food science. Morty's discovery of the horrifying truth about the spaghetti's origins represented one of the most psychologically devastating revelations in the entire series, as the recognition that every bite he had enjoyed with such enthusiasm was literally composed of someone's final moments, transformed his relationship with the meal from pleasure to existential horror. The knowledge that he had been consuming the physical manifestation of another being's death created forms of guilt and revulsion that no amount of rational analysis could adequately process. Rick's explanation of the biological processes that occurred on planet Kepler B during the inhabitants' suicides was delivered with the clinical detachment of a food scientist, describing fermentation or aging processes, treating the cortisol-induced transformation of alien intestines into pasta as simply another interesting example of how different species had evolved unique biochemical responses to extreme stress. His casual attitude toward the systematic harvesting of despair revealed how completely his multiversal experiences had severed his connection to normal human empathy. The unique chemical reactions that transformed the aliens' dying bodies into culinary delicacies were presented as marvels of biological engineering rather than tragedies of systematic exploitation, with Rick's enthusiasm for the scientific mechanisms involved completely overshadowing any consideration of the conscious suffering that made the transformations possible. His foodie appreciation for the flavor profiles created by terminal despair represented the ultimate expression of his ability to aestheticize and commodify other beings' pain. The planet's transformation into what was essentially a suicide factory designed to maximize spaghetti production revealed how quickly advanced civilizations could be corrupted when economic incentives were created around activities that should have been sources of social concern and intervention rather than commercial opportunity. The infrastructure that had been developed to facilitate and harvest alien deaths demonstrated systematic planning that treated conscious beings as renewable resources for culinary exploitation. The scenic bridge that had become the most popular suicide location was described with the kind of tourist board enthusiasm normally reserved for natural wonders or cultural landmarks, but its popularity was entirely based on its effectiveness as a platform for death rather than any inherent beauty or historical significance. The melting of safety rails to create giant spaghetti strainers represented the complete prioritization of commercial efficiency over any concern for the welfare of beings who might have been experiencing temporary crisis rather than genuine desire for death. The systematic removal of barriers and safeguards that might have prevented impulsive suicides demonstrated how economic interests could corrupt social institutions that were designed to protect vulnerable populations, transforming suicide prevention infrastructure into harvesting equipment that maximized the yield of raw materials for export to interdimensional markets. The planet's commitment to optimizing death production revealed moral bankruptcy that exceeded even Rick's normal standards for casual cruelty. Morty's horror at realizing he had been consuming the final moments of conscious beings was compounded by his recognition that Rick had served this meal to the entire family without any warning about its origins, making them all unknowing participants in a form of cannibalism that violated fundamental taboos about the treatment of the dead and the sanctity of conscious experience. The violation of informed consent added layers of betrayal to the existing moral horror. The casual way that Rick dismissed Morty's ethical concerns about consuming suicide spaghetti revealed his complete inability to understand why the origins of their food might be morally relevant to its enjoyment, treating questions about exploitation and suffering as abstract philosophical problems that had no bearing on practical decisions about nutrition and pleasure. His indifference to the source of their meal reflected psychological structures that had been systematically desensitized to others' pain. The economic system that had developed around suicide spaghetti demonstrated how quickly markets could emerge to exploit any form of suffering that could be transformed into consumer products, creating financial incentives that encouraged rather than discouraged behaviors that would normally be considered social problems requiring intervention and support. The planetary economy's dependence on death production revealed how capitalism could corrupt even the most basic human values. The various locations throughout the planet that had been optimized for suicide efficiency showed systematic urban planning designed around maximizing death production rather than supporting sustainable communities or promoting public welfare. The architecture and infrastructure modifications that facilitated harvesting operations revealed how completely the planet's development priorities had been corrupted by their export economy. The alien inhabitants who participated in the suicide spaghetti economy were not presented as inherently suicidal or culturally disposed toward death, but rather as beings whose circumstances had been systematically manipulated to encourage despair and hopelessness that served commercial interests, rather than addressing the underlying social problems that might have been resolved through different approaches to community organization and resource distribution. Morty's attempts to interfere with the suicide spaghetti production system were motivated by genuine humanitarian concern, but were also complicated by his recognition that sudden disruption of the planet's economic foundation might create different forms of suffering for populations who had become dependent on death-based industries for their survival. The complexity of the situation exceeded simple moral categories and created ethical dilemmas that had no clear solutions. The chaos that resulted from Morty's intervention in the suicide spaghetti trade demonstrated how quickly social systems could collapse when their economic foundations were suddenly eliminated, without alternative means of support being provided for affected populations. The violence and disorder that followed the disruption of their death-based economy revealed how quickly desperation could transform supposedly peaceful civilizations into scenes of brutal conflict. The transformation of the entire planet into what was essentially a spaghetti processing facility represented the complete subordination of social organization and cultural development to commercial interests that treated conscious beings as components in production processes rather than individuals deserving of respect and opportunities for flourishing. The infrastructure and logistics required for planetary-scale death harvesting revealed planning that had consumed entire civilizations. Rick's decision to end the suicide spaghetti trade through broadcasting Fred Bunks's complete life story and death was characteristically theatrical and designed to create maximum psychological impact on consumers rather than addressing the underlying economic and social structures that had made the industry possible in the first place. His solution focused on eliminating demand rather than providing alternatives for affected populations. The life story of Fred Bunks that Rick broadcast to destroy the market for suicide spaghetti was simultaneously a genuine human tragedy and a calculated piece of propaganda designed to make consumption of death-based products psychologically impossible for normal beings who retained connection to empathy and moral reasoning. The biographical details revealed a complete person whose suffering transcended its commercial value. The graphic presentation of Fred Bunk's suicide during the broadcast was designed to confront consumers with the full reality of what their dining choices had required, eliminating the psychological distance that had enabled them to enjoy the products without considering their human cost. The deliberate destruction of the aesthetic and culinary framework that had made death consumption palatable represented Rick's occasional capacity for moral action when sufficiently motivated. The market collapse that followed Rick's broadcast demonstrated how quickly consumer behavior could change when people were forced to confront the full implications of their purchasing decisions, but it also revealed how much of the global economy had become dependent on systematic exploitation that remained invisible to end users through careful marketing and distribution systems that obscured their origins. The violent reactions that viewers experienced while watching Fred Bunks's life and death story reflected normal human responses to being forced to acknowledge their complicity in systematic suffering that had been disguised as luxury, consumption, but the intensity of their revulsion also suggested how completely they had disconnected from the moral implications of their choices through willful ignorance and selective attention. The economic disruption that resulted from the sudden elimination of the suicide spaghetti market created new forms of suffering for alien populations who had become economically dependent on death-based industries, revealing how quickly humanitarian interventions could create unintended consequences that exceeded the original problems they were designed to solve. The complexity of addressing systematic exploitation required more sophisticated approaches than simple market elimination. The return to the Smith family dinner table following the destruction of the suicide spaghetti trade provided Rick with another opportunity to demonstrate his complete indifference to moral consistency, as his casual warning about the Salisbury steak's horrifying origins suggested that their meal had simply been replaced with another form of systematically harvested suffering rather than genuine ethical alternatives. The family's decision to laugh off Rick's warning about their new meal and remain willfully ignorant about its origins, rather than demanding ethical food choices, revealed their own complicity in systematic exploitation and their preference for comfortable denial over the difficult moral work that genuine ethical consumption would require. Their chosen ignorance reflected broader patterns of consumer behavior that enabled systematic suffering to continue. The horror of That's a Morty was not found in its graphic content or science fiction elements, but in its systematic exploration of how easily suffering could be transformed into consumer products through marketing and distribution, systems that obscured their origins from end users, creating forms of moral complicity that extended far beyond the immediate participants in exploitation to encompass everyone who benefited from systematically harvested misery disguised as luxury experiences. The catastrophic cascade of unintended consequences that would ultimately destroy Morty's original universe began with the most innocent and universal of teenage desires: the desperate need to win the romantic attention of someone whose indifference had become a source of daily humiliation and social anxiety that made normal high school existence feel like prolonged torture designed specifically to highlight his inadequacies and failures. The love potion that Morty begged Rick to create represented not just adolescent romantic fantasy, but the fundamental human longing to be valued and desired by someone whose opinion mattered enough to define self-worth and social status. Rick's casual agreement to solve Morty's romantic problems through chemical manipulation revealed his characteristic approach to interpersonal relationships as technical challenges that could be resolved through superior scientific knowledge rather than emotional intelligence or genuine understanding of human psychology and social dynamics. The dismissive ease with which he treated Morty's request demonstrated his complete inability to recognize that authentic romantic connections required mutual respect and genuine compatibility rather than artificial biochemical alterations that eliminated the other person's autonomy and choice. The love potion that Rick synthesized using DNA from creatures whose mating behaviors had evolved under completely different biological and social pressures than human courtship rituals reflected his fundamental misunderstanding of how emotions and attraction functioned within human social systems. His assumption that love could be reduced to simple chemical reactions that could be replicated across species barriers revealed the same mechanistic thinking that characterized his approach to all forms of human experience and connection. The initial success of the love potion in making Jessica romantically interested in Morty created a brief moment of triumph that seemed to validate Rick's technological approach to solving emotional problems, but the artificial nature of her attraction was immediately apparent to anyone who understood that genuine romantic interest involved recognition of personal qualities rather than involuntary biological responses to chemical stimuli. The hollow satisfaction that Morty experienced from Jessica's chemically induced affection foreshadowed the deeper problems that would emerge. The viral spread of the love potion through airborne transmission, when Jessica sneezed, transformed what had been intended as a targeted intervention in Morty's romantic life into an apocalyptic biological weapon that demonstrated how quickly scientific solutions to personal problems could spiral beyond any possibility of control or containment. The casual nature of the initial infection vector highlighted how unpredictable and dangerous Rick's inventions could become when they interacted with variables he had failed to consider. The school dance that became ground zero for the love potion pandemic was transformed from a typical adolescent social event into a scene of hormonal chaos that revealed the predatory and dangerous nature of artificially induced romantic obsession. The sight of hundreds of students pursuing Morty with the single-minded intensity of sexual predators demonstrated how quickly love could become indistinguishable from violence when it was chemically manufactured rather than naturally developed through mutual recognition and respect. Morty's terror at finding himself the object of universal desire revealed the fundamental difference between wanting to be loved and actually experiencing the reality of being pursued by beings whose attraction was not based on recognition of his personal qualities, but rather on involuntary, biological responses that eliminated their capacity for rational thought or behavioral self-control. The nightmare of being hunted by people who claimed to love him highlighted the violence inherent in non-consensual romantic manipulation. Rick's first antidote represented his attempt to solve the problem through additional chemical intervention rather than addressing the underlying issues with his original approach to manipulating human emotions and relationships. The praying mantis DNA that he incorporated into his corrective serum was chosen for its supposed ability to counteract the love potion's effects, but reflected his continued reliance on biological reductionism that treated complex human emotions as simple chemical processes that could be easily reversed. The transformation of the infected population into mantis-human hybrids was more horrifying than their previous condition because it combined the predatory obsession of the love potion with the physical capabilities and violent instincts of creatures whose mating behaviors included systematic cannibalism and brutalization of sexual partners. The hybrid creatures retained their artificial love for Morty but expressed it through behaviors that were even more threatening and destructive than simple romantic pursuit. Rick's second antidote attempt revealed his growing desperation and his willingness to use increasingly dangerous biological agents in his efforts to undo the consequences of his original mistake. But each successive intervention created mutations that were more grotesque and threatening than the previous versions. The cascade of failed solutions demonstrated how quickly scientific problem-solving could become an exercise in damage escalation rather than genuine repair. The final transformation of Earth's population into Cronenberg-style mutations represented the complete collapse of human civilization and the reduction of formerly intelligent beings into grotesque monsters whose biological functions had been so thoroughly corrupted that they could no longer be considered recognizably human in their appearance, behavior, or cognitive capabilities. The casual reference to David Cronenberg's body horror films highlighted the deliberate grotesqueness of their final forms. The mutations that characterized the Cronenberg population were not simply aesthetic changes, but fundamental alterations to their biological and neurological structures that eliminated their capacity for rational thought, social organization, or any form of existence that resembled normal human community and culture. The transformation represented not just physical horror, but the complete destruction of everything that made human civilization possible and meaningful. Rick's analysis of the situation that led him to declare their original dimension beyond repair reflected his characteristic willingness to abandon problems rather than investing the time and effort that genuine solutions would require. But it also demonstrated his recognition that some forms of damage were too extensive to reverse through any known scientific methods. His casual acceptance of the need for dimensional abandonment revealed how disposable he considered individual realities when they became inconvenient. The interdimensional scan that Rick conducted to locate a suitable replacement reality represented perhaps the most disturbing application of his portal technology, as he systematically evaluated infinite, alternate versions of their lives to find one where their counterparts had solved the love potion crisis, but died immediately afterward from unrelated causes. The clinical efficiency with which he located their replacements revealed his complete emotional detachment from the significance of individual identity and personal continuity. The discovery of their own corpses in the replacement dimension forced Morty to confront the fundamental replaceability of his existence and the casual indifference with which Rick treated questions of identity and authenticity that seemed crucial to normal human psychological functioning. The sight of his own dead body represented not just mortality, but the recognition that his continued existence was contingent on the deaths of alternate versions of himself. The burial scene where Rick and Morty interred their own corpses in the backyard of the house they were about to inhabit was simultaneously practical necessity and existential horror, as they were literally burying their own identities while preparing to assume the lives of their dead counterparts. The casual way that Rick handled the burial process contrasted sharply with Morty's obvious trauma and horror at the situation. Morty's psychological breakdown during and after the burial reflected his normal human attachment to concepts of identity and personal continuity that Rick's multiversal perspective had rendered meaningless, but which remained essential components of healthy psychological functioning for beings who had not been systematically desensitized to questions about authenticity and replaceability. His trauma was entirely reasonable response to impossible circumstances. Rick's dismissive attitude toward Morty's existential crisis demonstrated his complete inability to understand or respond appropriately to normal human emotional needs and psychological responses to traumatic experiences, treating Morty's horror at their situation as irrational squeamishness, rather than legitimate psychological distress that deserved acknowledgement and support. His emotional unavailability compounded the trauma of their dimensional displacement. The family that welcomed them back in the replacement dimension was identical to their original family in every observable respect, but Rick and Morty's knowledge that these were not the same people created permanent psychological barriers that would make authentic emotional connections impossible, despite the perfect similarity of their relationships and shared experiences. The performance of normal family life became an elaborate deception that served Rick's needs while traumatizing Morty. The dinner conversation that followed their return to normal family life revealed how easily domestic routines could continue despite the complete artificial nature of their circumstances, but also highlighted the psychological isolation that Rick and Morty now experienced as the only people who knew the truth about their identity theft and dimensional displacement. Their shared secret created complicity that neither could escape or resolve through confession. Beth's expressions of maternal love and concern for Morty's well-being were directed towards someone she believed to be her son, but who was actually an imposter from another dimension, creating a relationship that was simultaneously genuine and completely false depending on how questions of identity and authenticity were evaluated. The complexity of their family bonds transcended simple categories of real and artificial connection. Jerry's continued antagonism toward Rick remained unchanged despite the dimensional replacement, suggesting that their relationship dynamics were so fundamental that they persisted across alternate realities, but also highlighting how superficial most interpersonal conflicts were compared to the existential questions about identity and consciousness that Rick and Morty were now forced to navigate without external support or understanding. Summer's teenage concerns and social problems continued exactly as they had before the dimensional replacement, demonstrating how normal human worries and preoccupations remained constant across realities, while also emphasizing how trivial most daily concerns seemed compared to the cosmic-scale identity crises that Rick's adventures regularly created for people who became involved in his scientific past, experiments and interdimensional travel. The psychological adaptation that Rick and Morty were forced to develop in response to their displacement involved systematic suppression of normal human responses to identity, confusion, and moral complexity, creating coping mechanisms that would enable them to function in their stolen lives, while preventing them from processing the full implications of their situation through healthy emotional and psychological channels. The normalization of identity theft and reality abandonment that followed their successful integration into the replacement dimension established patterns of behavior that would characterize their future adventures, as Rick's casual willingness to replace inconvenient realities with more manageable alternatives became a standard operating procedure that eliminated the consequences of his mistakes, while creating new forms of psychological trauma for family members who retained connection to normal human values. The horror of Rick Potion number 9 was not found in its body horror elements or science fiction concepts, but in its systematic exploration of how easily personal identity and authentic relationships could be revealed as arbitrary constructions that had no ultimate significance beyond their utility for psychological comfort and social functioning, creating existential anxiety that transcended normal fears about death or violence to address fundamental questions about the meaning and value of individual consciousness in contexts where perfect replacements were readily available. The psychological torture that would force Morty to confront the weight of infinite guilt began with Rick's wounded ego responding to criticism of what appeared to be an absurdly impractical escape plan, involving a fake vat of acid that seemed designed more for theatrical effect than actual utility in dangerous situations. The checkpoint device that Rick created ostensibly to teach Morty about respecting his contingency plans would prove to represent perhaps the most sophisticated form of emotional manipulation that Rick had ever inflicted on his grandson, transforming the boy's natural desire for consequence-free experimentation into a weapon that would systematically destroy his capacity for normal moral reasoning. Rick's presentation of the checkpoint device as a simple tool that would allow Morty to save his progress through life like a video game checkpoint system was deliberately designed to appeal to adolescent fantasies about eliminating the anxiety and regret that accompanied irreversible choices and their unintended consequences. The casual way that Rick described the device's capabilities concealed the elaborate psychological trap he was constructing around Morty's natural desire to explore possibilities without facing permanent repercussions for his decisions and actions. The initial experiments that Morty conducted with what he believed was consequence-free living revealed both his fundamental moral decency and his normal teenage curiosity about experiences that social constraints and fear of punishment had previously made impossible to explore safely. His early uses of the device were relatively innocent attempts to satisfy curiosity and test boundaries rather than expressions of genuine malice or desire to harm others, suggesting that his moral foundations remained intact despite exposure to Rick's corrupting influence. The progression from innocent experimentation to increasingly bold actions demonstrated how quickly the apparent elimination of consequences could corrupt even well-intentioned people by removing the natural feedback mechanisms that normally prevented escalation from minor boundary testing to genuinely harmful behavior. Morty's growing comfort with actions he would never have considered under normal circumstances revealed how rapidly moral boundaries could erode when external constraints were eliminated. The locker room incident that Morty engaged in during his consequence-free period represented not genuine sexual predation, but rather the kind of adolescent boundary testing that became possible when normal social and legal consequences were apparently eliminated. But the violation of privacy and consent that his actions represented remained morally significant, regardless of whether permanent consequences would follow. His behavior revealed how easily normal moral reasoning could be suspended when immediate punishment seemed impossible. The relationship with Jessica that Morty developed during this period was artificially enhanced by his ability to reset conversations and interactions until he achieved desired outcomes, creating a connection that appeared genuine but was actually based on systematic manipulation and elimination of any responses that didn't serve his romantic objectives. The artificial nature of their chemistry was concealed by the apparent authenticity of her positive responses to his carefully optimized approaches. The coffee shop encounter that would transform Morty's understanding of love and loss began as another experiment in consequence-free social interaction, but developed into something far more profound when he met a young woman whose genuine interest and compatibility created the first authentic emotional connection he had experienced since beginning his checkpoint experiments. The natural development of their relationship contrasted sharply with his manipulated interactions with Jessica, revealing the difference between artificial and genuine human connection. The plane crash that stranded Morty and his new romantic partner together created circumstances that would test his commitment to their relationship against his attachment to the checkpoint system that had enabled his recent freedom from consequences. But the months of survival experiences they shared would prove to be more meaningful and transformative than any of his previous adventures with Rick or his family. The isolation and mutual dependence that characterized their survival period eliminated external distractions that might have prevented deep emotional bonding. The wilderness survival skills that Morty and his partner developed together during their extended isolation created practical knowledge and shared experiences that formed the foundation for genuine intimacy and mutual respect, but more importantly provided Morty with direct experience of how meaningful relationships could develop when people faced genuine challenges together, rather than relying on technological solutions or artificial advantages to eliminate difficulties and uncertainties. The construction projects that occupied their time during the survival period served both practical functions for maintaining their safety and comfort, and psychological functions for creating shared goals and collaborative pay, problem-solving experiences that strengthened their emotional bond, while also providing Morty with first-hand knowledge of how genuine partnership could function when both people contributed equally to their mutual welfare and survival. The decision-making processes that Morty and his partner developed for managing their limited resources and addressing survival challenges created patterns of communication and mutual respect that contrasted sharply with the manipulative, and controlling dynamics that characterized Morty's relationships with his family, particularly his interactions with Rick, who had conditioned him to expect that superior knowledge or capabilities automatically justified dominance and control over decision-making processes. The emotional intimacy that developed between Morty and his partner during their isolation was built on genuine mutual vulnerability and authentic sharing of fears, hopes, and personal experiences, rather than the carefully constructed personas and strategic self-revelation that characterized most of Morty's social interactions, particularly those that had been optimized through checkpoint resets to achieve desired responses rather than honest communication. The recognition that using the checkpoint device would eliminate not just their current circumstances, but also all the memories and experiences that had made their relationship meaningful, created the first genuine moral dilemma that Morty had faced since beginning his consequence-free experimentation, forcing him to choose between his attachment to technological control over outcomes and his commitment to preserving something authentic and irreplaceable that had developed naturally. The months that passed without Morty activating the checkpoint device represented his growing maturity and developing capacity for genuine emotional attachment that transcended his previous need for control and certainty about outcomes, but also demonstrated his recognition that some experiences were valuable precisely because they couldn't be repeated or optimized through technological manipulation. His willingness to accept uncertainty and potential loss reflected psychological growth that his checkpoint experiments had paradoxically enabled. The accidental activation of the checkpoint device by Jerry represented the kind of random catastrophe that no amount of careful planning could prevent, but its timing at the moment when Morty had finally learned to value authentic experience over controlled outcomes created a tragedy that transcended simple bad luck to approach cosmic-scale injustice. The casual nature of Jerry's interference highlighted how vulnerable genuine human connections were to disruption by people who lacked understanding of their significance. The desperate attempts that Morty made to recreate his lost relationship after the checkpoint reset revealed both his genuine love for his partner and his complete inability to understand that authentic human connections couldn't be manufactured through repetition of external circumstances or behavioral patterns, no matter how precisely he attempted to replicate the conditions that had originally brought them together. The increasingly frantic and inappropriate behavior that Morty displayed while trying to force the recreation of natural romantic development demonstrated how his checkpoint experiences had corrupted his understanding of genuine human interaction by teaching him to expect that persistence and optimization could overcome any obstacle, including the fundamental impossibility of artificially manufacturing authentic emotional connections between people who lacked shared history. The breakdown that Morty experienced when he finally accepted that his lost relationship couldn't be recovered through technological manipulation or strategic social engineering represented not just personal grief, but also his recognition that his entire approach to managing consequences and optimizing outcomes had been based on fundamental misunderstandings about what made human experiences valuable and meaningful. Rick's revelation that the checkpoint device had never actually reset time, but had instead transported Morty into alternate dimensions where he systematically murdered native versions of himself, represented perhaps the most devastating psychological assault that Rick had ever inflicted on anyone, transforming what Morty had believed was consequence-free experimentation into a campaign of interdimensional genocide that he had conducted unknowingly against innocent victims. The demonstration that Rick provided by merging multiple timeline branches forced Morty to experience the accumulated memories and death experiences of dozens of alternate versions of himself, creating psychological trauma that transcended normal human capacity for processing guilt and responsibility by making him simultaneously victim and perpetrator of systematic murder conducted across infinite realities without his knowledge or consent. The Crimes Tribunal, where various versions of Morty's victims demanded justice for actions he had committed across different realities while believing his behavior was consequence-free, created legal and moral complexities that exceeded any framework for understanding individual responsibility and collective guilt. But the suffering of his victims remained real and deserving of acknowledgement, regardless of his ignorance about the true nature of his actions. The weight of infinite guilt that settled over Morty following Rick's revelation was not simply emotional response to learning about unintended consequences, but rather the crushing recognition that his desire for freedom from Belia responsibility had transformed him into exactly the kind of multiversal monster that Rick had become during his own quest to eliminate constraints and consequences that might interfere with his preferred outcomes. The psychological torture that Rick inflicted through his elaborate deception was designed not just to teach Morty a lesson about respecting his ideas, but also to demonstrate the fundamental impossibility of genuine consequence-free existence in a universe where every action had implications that extended far beyond immediate observation or understanding, making moral responsibility inescapable, even when consequences were hidden or delayed. The vat of acid escape that Rick had originally proposed as a backup plan was revealed to be not just practical emergency procedure, but also psychological metaphor for the degrading and humiliating experiences that would inevitably result from attempts to avoid genuine moral responsibility through technological solutions that promise to eliminate consequences without addressing underlying behavioral and ethical problems. The climb into the disgusting acid, while experiencing the full weight of his inadvertent crimes, represented Morty's forced acceptance of humiliation and degradation as the price for Rick's forgiveness and the restoration of their normal relationship dynamic, but it also symbolized his recognition that genuine moral development required accepting responsibility for consequences, regardless of whether they had been intended or understood at the time actions were taken. The satisfaction that Rick displayed at proving his point through Morty's systematic psychological destruction revealed the extent to which his need for validation and control had corrupted his capacity for genuine care about his Bontelli's grandson's welfare, transforming educational opportunities into elaborate revenge fantasies, designed to punish anyone who questioned his judgment or challenged his authority. The horror of the vat of acid episode was not found in its science fiction elements or graphic violence, but in its systematic exploration of how genuine human needs for security and freedom from consequences could be weaponized by people with superior knowledge and technological capabilities to create forms of psychological torture that were more devastating than physical violence while appearing to serve educational or protective functions. The deepest terror that any conscious being could experience was not the fear of death or physical pain, but the crushing certainty that the most important relationships in their existence were built on foundations of emotional manipulation and calculated indifference, disguised as protection and care. The fear hole that materialized in what could only be described as the most unlikely location for confronting existential horror. A Denny's bathroom at 3 a.m. represented not just a supernatural attraction, but a psychological trap designed to exploit the fundamental human need to believe that love and connection could transcend the arbitrary cruelties of an indifferent universe. The Carnival of Nightmares, where Rick and Morty first encountered the mysterious stranger in his sharp suit, was itself a manifestation of the kind of interdimensional tourism that had become routine for them. But the casual way that Rick approached even the most obviously dangerous attractions, revealed how completely his multiversal experiences had desensitized him to threats that would have terrified normal beings into immediate retreat from any location where reality itself seemed unstable and malevolent. The stranger's presentation of the fear hole as a unique entertainment experience was delivered with the practiced charm of someone who had spent considerable time studying human psychology and understanding exactly which psychological vulnerabilities could be exploited to convince people to voluntarily submit themselves to experiences that would systematically destroy their mental stability and emotional security. But his choice of Rick and Morty as subjects suggested knowledge about their specific psychological profiles that exceeded casual observation. Morty's impulsive decision to jump into the fear hole without considering potential consequences or seeking Rick's analysis of the situation represented not reckless bravery, but rather the kind of desperate need for novel experiences that had developed in response to months of adventures that had gradually numbed his capacity for normal emotional responses to danger and uncertainty, making even obviously threatening situations feel like welcome alternatives to the crushing routine of interdimensional violence. The personalized horror that the fear hole manifested around Morty's consciousness was not randomly generated nightmare imagery, but carefully calibrated psychological torture designed to exploit his specific anxieties about inadequacy, abandonment, and his growing recognition that his relationship with Rick might be fundamentally different from what he had been led to believe about their mutual care and protective connection. The abstract body horror that characterized Morty's initial fear hole experience represented not just visual terror, but the complete breakdown of his ability to distinguish between external threats and internal psychological collapse, creating forms of suffering that transcended physical pain to address fundamental questions about identity, consciousness, and the reliability of his own perceptions about the nature of reality and relationships. The dismemberment scenarios that pursued Morty through the fear hole's twisted landscape were not simply gore-based horror, but systematic attacks on his sense of bodily integrity and personal autonomy that reflected deeper fears about losing control over his own existence and becoming nothing more than a collection of interchangeable parts that could be manipulated or discarded according to other people's convenience and preferences. Rick's decision to dive into the fear hole to rescue Morty represented not genuine heroism, but rather his recognition that losing his grandson would eliminate his primary source of emotional anchoring and psychological stability, making his protective instincts fundamentally self-serving, rather than expressions of genuine care about Morty's welfare and development as an independent person deserving of respect and autonomy. The collaborative fight that Rick and Morty conducted against the fear hole's manifestations created temporary solidarity between them that felt genuine and emotionally satisfying. But their shared struggle against external threats also served to reinforce their psychological dependence on each other, while preventing the kind of honest examination of their relationship dynamics that might have revealed uncomfortable truths about manipulation and control. The apparent escape from the fear hole that Rick and Morty achieved through their combined efforts felt like genuine victory over forces that had threatened to destroy their relationship and individual psychological stability, but the relief and satisfaction they experienced was actually part of the fear hole's more sophisticated psychological manipulation, designed to make subsequent revelations about the illusory nature of their triumph more devastating and disorienting. The return home that followed their supposed victory over the fear hole created a false sense of normalcy and security that was immediately shattered by the impossible appearance of a younger version of Rick carrying a still living Diane, whose presence violated everything they understood about the fixed nature of Rick's tragic past and the irreversible consequences of Rick Prime's multiversal genocide against all versions of Rick's wife. The explosive disintegration of young Rick and Diane before anyone could process the implications of their presence served as the first clear indication that Rick and Morty had not actually escaped the fear hole, but remained trapped within increasingly sophisticated layers of psychological manipulation designed to exploit their deepest needs and most carefully guarded vulnerabilities about love, loss, and the possibility of redemption. The recognition that they remained imprisoned within the fear hole's influence created new forms of terror that transcended simple fears about physical safety or even psychological torture, as they were forced to confront the possibility that their perceptions of reality itself could not be trusted, and that their most meaningful experiences might be artificial constructions designed to serve purposes they could not understand or control. Rick's personal hell, disguised as paradise, involved systematic exposure to scenarios where he could potentially win back Diane through romantic gestures and emotional vulnerability that his normal psychological defenses would never permit him to attempt under genuine circumstances. But the artificial nature of these experiences made every moment of apparent progress toward reconciliation simultaneously hopeful and hollow. The dates and romantic scenarios that Rick experienced with the Diane manifestation within his personalized fear hole were not random torture, but carefully designed psychological experiments that exploited his deepest regrets about his original marriage, while also highlighting his complete inability to engage in genuine emotional intimacy, even when offered unlimited opportunities to correct his past mistakes and demonstrate growth. Morty's desperate attempts to escape the fear hole by systematically conquering his acknowledged fears represented his growing sophistication in understanding how psychological manipulation functioned, but his approach was ultimately doomed because it was based on the assumption that the fear hole operated according to logical principles rather than being designed to exploit whatever psychological vulnerabilities would create the most devastating forms of suffering. The spider eating, public embarrassment, and naked theatre performances that Morty subjected himself to in his attempts to overcome fear were genuinely difficult challenges that required real courage and psychological strength. But their failure to provide escape from the fear hole revealed that his most profound terrors were not the obvious phobias that he could identify and address through deliberate exposure, but rather existential anxieties that were too fundamental to his psychological structure to eliminate through behavioral interventions. The multiple false escapes that Rick and Morty experienced created increasing paranoia and uncertainty about the nature of reality itself, as each apparent victory over the fear hole's influence was revealed to be another layer of deception designed to make them increasingly desperate for genuine freedom, while also making it impossible for them to trust their own perceptions about whether they had achieved authentic liberation. The psychological exhaustion that accumulated through repeated cycles of hope and disappointment was not accidental byproduct of their imprisonment, but deliberate strategy designed to break down their normal defensive mechanisms and emotional barriers, making them increasingly vulnerable to the ultimate revelation that would expose the fundamental nature of their relationship and its impact on their individual psychological development and capacity for genuine human connection. The fear hole's revelation of Morty's ultimate terror was delivered with clinical precision, designed to maximize its psychological impact, while also highlighting the sophisticated understanding of human psychology that had enabled the creation of such specifically targeted forms of emotional torture. But the truth it revealed was not artificial construction, but accurate analysis of Morty's deepest emotional needs and most carefully hidden vulnerabilities. The crushing certainty that Rick would never admit he needed Morty represented not paranoid fantasy but realistic assessment of their relationship dynamics based on years of observation and experience, with Rick's systematic inability to acknowledge emotional dependence or vulnerability in ways that might compromise his sense of intellectual superiority and autonomous control over every aspect of their shared adventures and domestic life. The devastating nature of this fear was not that Rick might abandon Morty or cause him physical harm, but rather that their entire relationship was built on Rick's psychological needs while providing Morty with only the illusion of mutual dependence and reciprocal care, making him nothing more than a therapeutic tool whose value was purely instrumental, rather than recognition of his worth as an independent person deserving of genuine love and respect. The shattering of the fear hole's final simulation was triggered not by Morty's conquest of his terror, but by his complete acceptance of its truth, and his willingness to acknowledge that his deepest fear was also his most accurate understanding of the fundamental nature of his relationship with Rick, eliminating the psychological tension that had enabled the fear hole to maintain its hold over his consciousness. The awakening in the Denny's bathroom stall that followed the fear hole's destruction was not triumph over supernatural forces, but rather Morty's forced return to reality after being confronted with truths about his life that he lacked the psychological resources to process successfully, leaving him traumatized and isolated in circumstances that highlighted the mundane setting where his existential crisis had occurred. The discovery that Rick had never actually entered the fear hole represented the ultimate betrayal of Morty's assumptions about their mutual commitment and shared risk-taking, revealing that Rick's protective behavior was not based on genuine concern for Morty's welfare, but rather calculated analysis of costs and benefits that had determined intervention was unnecessary and potentially disadvantageous to Rick's own interests and objectives. The casual way that Rick dismissed Morty's desperate question about irreplaceability revealed not just his inability to provide emotional support when it was most needed, but also his fundamental indifference to Morty's psychological welfare, when acknowledging their mutual dependence might require him to admit vulnerability or emotional need that could compromise his sense of intellectual superiority and autonomous control over their relationship dynamics. Morty's physical clinging to Rick, despite his emotional devastation, represented the tragic irony of seeking comfort from the very person whose indifference had created the psychological trauma that made comfort necessary. But it also highlighted how thoroughly his psychological development had been shaped by their relationship in ways that made genuine independence and healthy emotional connections with other people increasingly difficult to achieve. The horror of Fear No Mort was not found in its supernatural elements or graphic imagery, but in its systematic exploration of how the deepest human need for acknowledgement and mutual dependence could be weaponized by people whose psychological structures made genuine emotional reciprocity impossible, creating relationships that provided the appearance of love and care, while actually serving as elaborate systems for extracting emotional labor and psychological support without providing meaningful connection or recognition in return. And so we conclude our journey through Rick and Morty's darkest episodes, where laughter dies and only truth remains. These stories reveal what lies beneath the show's surface: the profound loneliness of infinite power, the horror of losing yourself in endless possibilities, and the crushing weight of knowing that everything and everyone can be replaced across infinite realities. Perhaps the greatest darkness isn't the violence or body horror, but the recognition that even love becomes meaningless when filtered through the lens of infinite alternatives. As you drift towards sleep, remember that unlike Rick, you exist in singular reality, where each choice carries weight, each relationship is irreplaceable, and each moment of peace is precious precisely because it cannot be endlessly replicated. Rest now, in the comfort of your limitations, in the beautiful constraints that make love meaningful and loss devastating. Sweet dreams in this one, irreplaceable dimension where your existence matters not because it's infinite, but because it's singular and finite, and utterly, beautifully real.